I know that it's often been said that if you can remember the 1960s that you were not there. I suppose that I have some advantage for having entered the 1960s as a preschooler, but I can remember where I was when I heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. I was at my grandparents' home when I heard that Bobby Kennedy was shot. I remember Walter Cronkite telling us about the assassination of Martin Luther King. I went to a segregated school. I remember seeing coloreds-only drinking fountains. And more than that, I remember the vociferous debates about women's rights. I remember enough that if you long for the good old days, I'm willing to say that you were not there. I remember when my sister had to wear a skirt to school in the dead of winter, even when we were being dropped off by my dad on his way to work to stand outside for 30 or 40 minutes while my sister and all the other girls shivered in absurdly short skirts in the dead of a cold, cold Kentucky winter. I remember the public humiliation of anyone in church who got a divorce, no matter what the reason. I remember the shame involved for any young woman in high school who became pregnant. And I remember the fight that didn't come until the 1970s for a woman's right to govern her own body and how we lost the first fight for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. The arrival of the birth control pill was relatively new in those days, setting off a heated debate about what is God's role in pregnancy and the moral decisions to either prevent pregnancy or to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. The private and most personal aspects of a woman's life were literally put on the witness stand of a culture that did not want to give up on 19th century morals in light of 20th century medicine and culture. I don't miss those days. The prevalence of television news, the advent of a telephone in everyone's house, the explosion of publication were helping the world to awaken from its infancy. But there were casualties along the way. We didn't know how, very well, to protest a war while honoring the largely poor people who were drafted to fight in that war. The seeds of political polarization and distrust for government were planted in those years with the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the televised impeachment of Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. No matter how much TV sitcoms may try to romanticize that era, I was there, and it was nothing to idealize. And I was a white, male, Protestant, middle-class, heterosexual, which, so far as my people go, we were at the pinnacle of success in terms of power and culture at that time. I had only just adopted my little brown daughter when I moved to Springfield, and at my first Council of Churches annual dinner, the speaker was a former president of what was then called Southwest Missouri State University. And this distinguished white, male, Protestant, relatively upper middle class, heterosexual, spoke at length about the changing demographics in America. In intonations of dread and fear, he recited the numerical shifts from a white America to a majority non-white America, from a safely English-speaking America to a bilingual America. The brown immigrant woman I had mistakenly taken to dinner with me at that meeting kept looking at me as if I'd taken her to a KKK rally that I had innocently enough assumed would simply be a church dinner. I'm pretty sure that the speaker was trying to say that we all needed to prepare for substantive change in our nation, but he was not saying it with joyful anticipation. It was more of a call to anxiety, the kind of call that could easily be interpreted as a reminder to be sure and buy more guns and more ammunition for the coming anarchy. Now, more than 20 years have passed since that Council of Churches dinner, and I'm certain if the speaker in question heard how I described his presentation, that he would be mortified and that he would, just as segregationists of the 1960s love to say, some of my best friends are black people, he would insist that he had recited those numbers in some jubilant herald of good times to come. But that's not how it was heard. The gains made in the civil rights and women's rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, as well as the gains made in the gay rights movement as the millennium marked its passing, were in many ways the concessions of a majority to a minority. If women's rights can ever be understood as minority rights, that numerically doesn't work very well. But in the sense of those in power granting rights and power to people that were in a minority. But now as that majority fades into the reality of an approaching minority status, we are seeing some old bones of battles long ago fought and won coming back to life. The image of a field of dry bones in the book of Ezekiel is, of course, a highly symbolic account. It's a vision. It didn't actually happen. It's a vision. The question being posed to Ezekiel in this vision is if the ruined remains of Israel can possibly be revived. Could they come out of their time of exile and slavery and become a real nation again? And the vision is set on the battlefield where Judah had suffered its greatest defeat. Now, of course, there weren't really bones lying in the field in that, but everyone knew if they went out to the valley of Jezreel what had happened there. They understood that was the location where their nation had been completely and utterly defeated. The text has appealed to preachers for years who see themselves as a prophet preaching to a congregation of dry bones. It seems to rarely occur to preachers just exactly how narcissistic that really is. I've always hated the association of shepherding language with my profession, in which it's assumed that the pastor is a human shepherd and the congregation is comprised of sheep. If you've ever been around sheep very much, you would have to know this is not a compliment. You are not sheep, and I am not a shepherd. And you are most certainly not a field of dry bones being addressed by a living and breathing prophet. We together are either a prophetic community or I'm just another corpulent cleric with a lot of opinions and a blog space and a web page. The dry bones that I'm seeing coming back to life in our nation are really not the good news dry bones of Israel standing up to resume being a nation, but it's the dry bones of battles I thought we had won in the 60s and the 70s that we're having to fight all over again. I can't believe that we're discussing access to birth control. I cannot believe it. I cannot believe that we were able to rescind the Voter Rights Act and that states immediately, Texas and North Carolina, immediately taking steps to limit access to voting. I cannot believe that that is happening in the 21st century. What we called the pill way back then, for reasons I cannot comprehend, has become another political football. Rush Limbaugh made a complete fool out of himself, and how hard is that really? When he attacked a young college student 2 years ago, calling her derisive names, suggesting that she was a whore, that she was absolutely scandalously immoral because she wanted birth control pills included in her health care coverage. 2 years ago, it seemed like Rush Limbaugh was a lone lunatic. But since then, we've had corporations, churches, even politicians weighing in. The former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, suggesting that women simply need to hold their knees together. I can remember when Ann Landers said that 35 years ago, and she looked like a dinosaur when she said it. And this guy thinks he could be the president of the United States. Just last week, Alaskan State Senator Pete Kelly insisted that women who use contraception simply lack self-control. And he even suggested, now get this, that a woman should not be allowed to order a drink in a bar without taking a pregnancy test first. serious suggestion that bars should have pregnancy tests available so that a woman can show the bartender that she's not pregnant before getting a drink, which of course is not simply trying to get women back into a skirt, it's trying to get them into a burqa. It's trying to give men complete and total control of the social lives of women. What woman would ever go into a bar and order a drink if they had to take a pregnancy test first? It's an attempt to say women should stay home and that public gathering places are just for men. How like the Taliban does that sound? And not that this is a comfortable topic for the pulpit. Okay, it's comfortable for me. I'm about to make you uncomfortable because in the past 3 months, there have been more than 40 state and federal attacks on providing birth control to women without so much as a mention of public funding for male impotence medications and even $172 million spent by Medicare for a pump used by men. A device that until just recently I thought was just a joke in an Austin Powers movie. But I'm sad to tell you that these devices not only exist, but we are paying for them with our tax dollars for senior citizens to be able to be sexually active while we deny young women basic birth control. This is too crazy to have been written for a comedy sketch, but this is how Congress writes the federal budget. Abortion rights, hard fought for in the 1970s, has been under attack ever since the Roe v. Wade decision. Now it's failing on that front, having failed on the front of repealing Roe v. Wade and facing a declining majority. There is a veritable American Taliban trying to take us back to an era that none of us would ever want to live in again. Just this week, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court struck down over minority protest what little remained of the election reforms passed by Congress right after Watergate. It was right after Watergate that these election contribution regulations were put in place to help an entire generation to recover their confidence in their government, to believe that we were a part of a democracy and that everyone had a voice, and it wasn't just rich people and corporations that ran the country. The Congress passed these election contribution limits to help us believe that we really mattered. But the maximum limit that they set for 2 years of political donations for any individual was $75,000. And that was viewed as being a limit to free speech, $75,000. Now, folks, I want you to work with me here. In a democracy, doesn't freedom of speech mean that we all have freedom of speech? I mean, it's not freedom of speech if it's limited to just some people, right? But if money is speech, then the people who have more money, do they have more speech? Do they have more freedom of speech? Did lifting the maximum contribution to political campaigns at $75,000, did that affect any of you? Is that going to change your voice in American politics? Do any of you have more freedom of speech now than you had 2 weeks ago? Most people of modest income won't contribute anything to political campaigns. We vote, but most people of modest incomes don't contribute to political campaigns. If they're highly motivated, they might occasionally send $5 or $10. I'm highly motivated, and I earn a professional salary. Thank you all very much. But I've never made a political contribution of more than $50 because, quite frankly, I just don't think I can afford much more. If I thought it was urgent, if I thought Wendy Davis really had a chance to win, or if Elizabeth Warren were running for president, I might go crazy and donate $100. Of course, now the very wealthy on the other side of the equation can donate $1 million. So one wealthy person has as much freedom of speech as 1,000 people like me? In which case, do I still have freedom of speech? Or if you're one of the really big players, Sheldon Adelson donated $93 million in the 2012 election season. He's got more voice than 1 million people like me. And if you factor in all those $5 and $10 donors and no donors, he's got more speech than 20 or 30 million Americans have. Is that democracy? Is that right? We have at times, properly, derided the compromise, our founding fathers, the debate about, are black people people? Do black people count in a census when you're determining how many members of Congress does your state have? They reached a compromise in which in the Constitution of the United States it says that a black person is counted as, 3/5 of a person, a little more than a half, but not 3/4, 3/5 of a person. There were those that felt like slaves shouldn't be people at all. Southern slave owners who normally didn't want to grant citizenship to their slaves did want them counted in the census because they wanted more congressional representation. So they compromised on this 3/5 rule, which was a horrible, demeaning, morally repugnant page in American history. But you look at what the Supreme Court's done this week, and I might be inclined to say, well, at least it was 3/5. Because I'm now 1,000th of a person when it comes to political speech. Or we may be 1 in 1 million. In matters of political speech, the wealthy, in terms of Animal Farm, we're all equal, but some of us are a lot more equal than others. So that, men and women, if we do not speak collectively, we have no voice at all. We do not exist. We do not factor in if we do not speak collectively in large numbers. These protections of democracy are being dismantled in hurried succession with the assumption that the collective will of the people that demanded an end to the war in Vietnam, that demanded an end to segregation, an end to gender discrimination, and a liberation of the gay community, that will of collective voice and collective action is now so dead and asleep that they're just bones scattered across a battlefield, no longer willing to muster the energy or breath to resist a return to the days of domination, oppression, and control. The greatest criticism that I have of modern-day progressives is that our cynicism has become our favorite sacrament. There is no collective action ever taken by people who are just privately bitter. The real gift of Martin Luther King in the 1960s and of Reverend William Barber, who's the organizer of Moral Mondays in North Carolina. Their real gift is that they've somehow been able to get people to bring their anger, their cynicism, their disappointment, their refusal to accept oppression into a collective action so that when the legislature meets in North Carolina, that they will look out their windows and see thousands of people and not just 6 or 7 chubby preachers carrying signs. That they're getting thousands of people to march, to sing together, to worship together, to protest and organize so that they can bring the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the union movement, the gay rights movement together to speak with a single prophetic voice for justice. So can these dry bones of our former passions ever be knit together, covered with flesh, and given new breath? Can we speak against the oppressive institutions of our culture that want to take away women's rights, take away civil rights, take away gay rights? I don't know. I really don't know. But I hope so. Our only substantive hope is if we choose to stick together.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.